Now, I want to go into the Lord's Supper, and I want to address this issue of, was this a supper that the Lord had, or was it the Passover? Here are a few things of why we know this was a supper and not the actual Passover, okay? So first of all, Jesus was using wisdom as he spake of the Passover, knowing that they would not truly eat of it, and he himself would be the Passover. And we went over that in part 1 and how he was killed on the 14th day and so forth. Now, also notice in the account of this supper, there's no mention of eating lamb. You had to eat lamb at the feast of the Passover. There's no mention of bitter herbs, right? There's also, I want you to notice a detail, which we'll read in a minute, that when Judas left, when Jesus said, the one that I put in this sop is going to betray me, and Judas left. When he left, they thought, the scripture says, they thought he went to go buy items for the Passover. Now that's very important. And if this was the day you're supposed to eat the Passover, that day was a Sabbath day, the high Sabbath, and you couldn't do any work. Stores weren't open. They wouldn't even thought he went to a store if that was that day. So let me show you an example. This is what we went over last time. So you killed the Passover on the 14th. The high Sabbath was on the 15th. And this is where you ate the Passover, and it was also the high Sabbath. So you didn't do any work. And we're going to read that in a minute. But so if they were doing the Lord's Supper on the day you're supposed to eat the Passover and was taking the Passover, then Judas wouldn't have been going to no store, neither would they have thought he was going to a store. And that's because this really happened on the 13th, going into the night of the 14th. That is when he had that Lord's Supper. And we know what happened that night of the 14th. We went into that in great detail of what happened, which we'll talk a little bit, refresh a little bit here in a minute. So this is very important to understand with respect to knowing the details of what this supper actually was. And so he really had a supper with them, and he was showing that this was the close of a time period, and he was showing that he was going to be that lamb, that they was going to drink wine new with him in his kingdom. That bread was going to represent the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, and he was preparing them for something. Now, I want to show you some more scriptures, though, where it gets a little confusing if you don't realize what Jesus was doing. Remember when Paul said, I'm a Roman, but he was really a Roman citizen. But he was a Jew. He was using wisdom. Now let's look at this. Look at some scriptures. Let's go to Mark 14, and let's look at the first and second verse.
After 2 days was the feast of the Passover and of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. But they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar of the people.
So in this illustration, it says, after 2 days was the feast of the Passover. Well, the feast of the Passover and unleavened bread took place on the 15th. And so he's saying 2 days from now will be the feast of the Passover, which puts us the night of the 13th, which shows us that this was not the time of eating the Passover when he was having this supper. Very, very important. Now, let's go to another scripture in Luke 22 and 1.
Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover.
So here he said it's drawing nigh, and we talked about this in our first part 1. It's drawing nigh. This is still Tuesday. Now let's go to another scripture in John 13 and 1.
Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end.
All right, so this is still the 13th, starting to get later, starting to merge into the 14th, like we talked about how the day and the night begin to merge. It's getting late, and here he is preparing to have this supper, but this is still, again, before the time of the feast of the Passover. Now let's go to Matthew 26 and 18. Now this is important, so keep this in mind. When Jesus talked to them, I want you to notice that he started to tell them things to do. And he said, I want you to go find a room. And when you find that room, say unto this person about the Passover. Because everyone in that time period, they knew about the Passover and they would be willing to work with you to give you a room. So he said, this is what you need to say. But he didn't, but this is again, he's using the time period and what was going on in the time period to coordinate them getting together for this meeting space. But did they actually eat the Passover? That is the key. Now let's read this in Matthew 26 and 18.
And he said, Go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, The master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples.
So the Lord told his disciples to go tell this man that owned the place where they could have this room. He says, say unto him, my master's time is at hand and we're going to keep the Passover. This is again him telling them what to say, which makes sense because everyone would understand that. But did they actually eat the Passover? That's the question. They could have kept this room for several days to go through the ceremony of the Passover because we're going into Wednesday night now, and that is the day you kill the Passover, and then the next day, that evening, you begin to eat it. That night you begin to eat it. So this, he's making arrangements. And so it makes sense that the man would say, sure, you can use this room for your Passover. Everyone's getting their room and getting ready and getting prepared, right? The 14th day was a day of preparation and they were moving into that day. So this is why you hear him using that. But Jesus knew in his heart that he was going to be the Passover. He knew he was going to get arrested. He knew what was going to happen in Rome. He knew, but he couldn't tell them. They might even have tried to stop it if they really knew the details. But this is why Jesus used this. Now let's go to Luke 22 and look at the 7th and 8th verse.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat.
Now here he's saying, this is the day the Passover must be killed. What day does the Passover get killed? On the 14th day. So this is that night going into Wednesday night. It's now the 14th. And he's telling them, go and prepare and get the things that are necessary for the Passover. They're keeping those customs, that they're, get the room ready. Make sure you go find a place for us to meet together and all of that. This is what he's starting to tell them to do. They haven't actually got a lamb. They haven't killed a lamb. They're not eating a lamb, but he's using this language, and all the disciples, they understood this was the custom. That is what they were supposed to do. But really, he wants to get them in that room, and here he's going to begin to talk to them about many, many different things. Now, let's go to John 13, and we're going to read the 29th and 30th verse. And this gives you an example of what I was talking about with respect to Judas. The disciples would have not said this if it was the day you're supposed to eat the Passover, which was the 15th, the high Sabbath.
For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Jesus had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. He then, having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night.
So it was night. So this is Wednesday night, okay? And Wednesday night, Jesus said, the one who I'm sopping with, when he put his bread in the sop, and he said, the one that I'm sopping with, this is the one that's going to betray me. This all happened at that supper, right? They weren't eating any lamb. There were no bitter herbs, but they had bread there, no doubt. It doesn't even say it was unleavened. We don't know. But they were, as he did this at night, Judas then, in another account, it says he told Judas, what thou doest, do quickly, right? And Judas runs out. Now, the disciples thought he might have been going to get something pertaining to the feast because this was the 14th day, the day of preparation. But if this was the day you're supposed to eat the Passover, that would have been the 15th. And so we know they weren't eating the Passover, and they would not have eaten the Passover on the wrong day, right? You just don't do that in Jewish custom. You have to do it on the day or it's not the Passover.